Welcome everyone to our webinar broadcasting from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, Urbana, Illinois, and New York today. I'm Corey Geiger, editor of Hoards Dairyman, and you can see on your screen that we're proud to bring this webinar with Nina Teicholz as the presenter today. This New York Times best-selling author will be talking about animal fats separating fact from fiction, and we'll discuss the history of how saturated fats, including butter and some of those found in cheese, became unfairly vilified based on weak science, and how the idea these fats cause heart disease has been thoroughly debunked. We bring you this webinar to you because of great support of our sponsors, and today Hoards Dairyman is sponsoring this. And this is the 8th year we've hosted a webinar on the second Monday of each month, noon Central Time. And as long as you subscribe to this webinar here, you'll get an email the Friday before and the day of, so you can be reminded of these awesome webinars. Our co-host is Mike Hutchins, and Jim Baltz is serving as the webinar producer. Mike, go ahead.
Yes, Corey, very good. It's my pleasure to introduce Nina. She attended Yale and Stanford, where she studied biology and majored in American Studies. Nina has a master's degree from Oxford University and served as Associate Director for the Center of Globalization and Stability Development at Columbia University. As you mentioned earlier, she lives in New York City. And of course, we're well aware of her award-winning book, Big Fat Surprise. She is a technical investigative journalist and author of that great, and that's been recognized by several organizations as a bestseller, I believe, Nina. So with that, welcome to the Hoards Dairyman webinar, and the program is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is really great to be talking to your audience. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, so I think we should just launch in. There's a lot to cover, and I'm sure you're curious about what we're going to be talking about. That is some of the journals and that endorsed my book. And I just think it's important to put it out there because the book was quite controversial, still is. And so it's important to know that there are sort of senior level medical journals and organizations that really believe the book has merit to it. So how did I get started on this whole journey? Why would anybody spend a decade researching saturated fat? Well, like all of you out there, when I started this 15 years ago, I was probably like you, very confused. You can find information about any diet out there on anything, and they all seem to have their evidence base to them. And so what to do, how to feed your children, that's a crucial question. And I came to this without any preconceptions. And I was really never thought I'd put a piece of meat on the cover of my book. I mean, after all, I'm from Berkeley, California, home of vegetarianism. Then I moved to New York City, second home of vegetarianism. I myself was a vegetarian for 25 plus years. That's why I was overweight, or I really had really bad hair in high school. And I think it's also just important to say by way of disclaimer that I received no industry support to write my book, not since, I do not take any support from any interested industry of any kind. So, although I do accept some funds for speaking. So this is our current diet recommendations. And you've all probably seen, now we have My Plate, but everybody's probably pretty familiar with the food pyramid. And the Mediterranean diet, which is touted as one of the top diets to eat, is very much like the USDA government food pyramid. In the Mediterranean diet, you'll notice that meat is in the teeny tiny tip of that pyramid. You can eat even more sweets than meat, according to their diet. But these are basically the main recommendations out there by official organizations. So let's take a poll. How much do you try to follow this diet?
Wow, very good. Corey, you were mentioned earlier. How would you vote on this one if you were allowed to vote?
I think it would be something that I would definitely take a look at, and it's what Mike's referencing. In the past 2 years, I've lost over 50 pounds, and it's been a concerted effort, but it's really gotten me to think about food in what I eat every day. And Mike, you and I are on the road a lot, and I think eating is a issue that we both face, especially when we're not home as much.
Boy, when you're tied into a conference, and you're kind of stuck as far as that goes. Well, it looks like we've got nearly 60% of the vote in. So, Jim, let's go ahead and close it. And Nina, are you surprised with the answers here? And you can read them off to our participants.
Wow, look at all you converts out there. So 60% follow the reverse of that diet. I like you already. 28% follow it with some exceptions, and 12% follow that diet. So it's not a resounding approval of the government's recommendations. So great. Well, let's see. How did I get started on this? Well, I had written this article on trans fats for Gourmet magazine, and at that point, it was the first time I'd ever been really introduced to the subject of dietary fat, other than growing up thinking, just don't eat fat because that'll make you fat. And but it really drew me into this whole world of dietary fat, which is what we've really obsessed about most and has been at the core of most of our dietary recommendations: low fat, high fat, non-fat, good fat, bad fats. I mean, it's really it's been the focus of our obsession. So this drew me into this fascinating world, and although I got a contract to write a book about trans fats, that became a contract to write a book about all fats. I read thousands of scientific papers, nearly a decade of research, really trying to get to the bottom of this question: what is going on with our recommendations about dietary fats? It seems we had gotten it completely upside down and backward. So that's how I got started. One of the questions that really stuck in my mind when I started out this journey was, how do we explain this? How do we explain right around 1980, obesity taking off in America? And of course, there's a curve much like this for type 2 diabetes that follows a little later. And then, of course, we see this not only in the US, but around the world. What happened in 1980? Well, how do we come to this belief that fat, and especially saturated fat, is bad for health? It really started with this: President Eisenhower's heart attack in the 1950s. He was out of the Oval Office for 10 days. That's his heart attack. And this was really when heart disease had risen from pretty much out of nowhere, very rare in the early 1900s, to become the nation's #1 killer. And so the whole nation was in this state of panic about what causes heart disease. There were a number of competing theories about it. There was this belief that maybe it was vitamin deficiency, or maybe it was the type A personality, too much aggression and stress. Maybe it was excessive auto fuel and exhaust. But there was one theory that really carried the day, and that idea was called the diet heart hypothesis. That idea was that saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet would lead to elevated cholesterol in your blood, and that would clog your arteries and give you a heart attack. That was the very simple idea, diet heart hypothesis. And that was promoted by a champion named Ancel Keys, and he was able to insert that idea into the American Heart Association, such that in 1961, the American Heart Association became the first organization anywhere in the world telling Americans to limit their consumption of saturated fats and cholesterol in order to prevent heart disease. This is where it all started. This is like the little acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today. And what did this mean? It meant, in effect, cutting out these foods that are a little higher in saturated fats and replacing them with polyunsaturated fats. So the most obvious swap here is butter was replaced by margarine. And then you weren't supposed to eat butter and cheese and meat. And the idea was somehow to replace that with polyunsaturated vegetable oils. But the idea was cut out saturated fat, replace it with polyunsaturated fat in order to avoid a heart attack. So I just want to show here how little sense that advice made at the time when it was recommended. Here you see that red arrow is President Eisenhower's heart attack. Well, saturated fats are already falling in consumption in the US at that point because vegetable oils had already started nosing in on the butter market mainly. And Crisco was replacing lard. So it really didn't seem like saturated fats were falling. How could they be causing heart disease? What was rising in lockstep with rising rates of heart attacks was polyunsaturated vegetable oil consumption, margarine and Crisco. So this idea really made no sense at the time, just in terms of the basic ecological changes in, but nevertheless, nobody seemed to notice this data at the time. And the diet heart hypothesis really carried the day. And here's Ancel Keys, who proposed this idea. He was a physiologist from the University of Minnesota. He was the one who came up with this hypothesis, and really he was this incredible outsized, aggressive individual who had an unshakable faith in his own beliefs. He was called a bully even by his friends because he had this capacity to argue anyone into the ground. He really had tremendous confidence in his own beliefs, and he was I think the most influential nutrition scientist of the 20th century. Here he is. This is the same year, he's on the cover of Time. This is the same year that American Heart Association recommendation came out, 1961. So, but what was the evidence for that American Heart Association recommendation that was so influential when it came out? Well, it really amounted to just one study called the 7-country study that coincidentally was conducted by Ancel Keys. And that was a study that was done in the 1960s. It took place in 7 countries around the world, which you can see here. And that study seemed to show what Ancel Keys had set out to prove, which was that saturated fats correlated with consumption of saturated fats correlated with cardiovascular death. But and because this was such an important study, I really went into it in great detail. I would say I spent 6 months tracking down every single papers that they had published in foreign journals and foreign languages, seemingly to try to bury some of the inconvenient truths about the study. One of the inconvenient truths about that study is that Keys clearly cherry-picked his countries. So just going back to show you the countries that he chose. Well, here's the data. When he was choosing those countries, here is the data that he showed about fat and consumption and deaths. And here you can see it seems an absolute no-brainer that the more fat you eat, rising perfectly along this line, the greater your risk of death. And this is the chart that he showed to justify his study. And these are the countries that he chose. Many of these are countries that he chose to be in his study. Well, what was the evidence that actually existed at the time? This is what Keys chose. This is the evidence that actually existed at the time, showing, actually there are countries all over the place on this. It's not quite as the continuum that he presented. If for instance, if Keys had chosen to include in his study, say, Germany or France or Switzerland, where it's well known that they have high saturated fat consumption, they eat a lot of eggs and cheese, and they have extremely low rates of heart disease. But Ancel Keys didn't go there. He instead went to Greece, Italy, Yugoslavia, where he knew that they ate a very low amount of saturated fat because it was in post-World War II conditions, and they also seemed to suffer from very low rates of heart disease. So it's fair to say that he cherry-picked his countries. There's just one other data point in here. This is sort of amusing, but to show you, these are all populations that have been studied in various parts of the world. The Inuit are from Greenland, and the Maasai warriors in Kenya. They eat huge amounts of fat. They eat like 70, 80% of their diet is fat, and they have almost no heart disease. So, and Ancel Keys actually knew about both the Maasai and the Inuit, but he obviously did not choose those populations to study. So that was just one of the flaws that made his study unreliable. I give you another one here, which is a little more just emblematic of his research methodology, which was sort of to ignore anything that didn't agree with his hoped for outcome. So he fell in love. His star subjects in this study of his were from the island of Crete, where he went and he really fell in love with this population. They were peasants. They seemed to be very long lived. They toiled on the soil all day long. They seemed to eat very little meat and cheese. Well, it turned out that in one of the 3 study periods that Ancel Keys went there with his team, they arrived during Lent, when people were avoiding those foods religiously. So thereby definitely undercounting the amount of saturated fats that they were eating, and really undermining his study generally. Anyway, that's sort of just an emblematic example of how his study, although it came to be the bedrock of nutrition science, was deeply flawed. And I think above all, it's a study that can only show, it's called an epidemiological study. It can only show association and not establish causation. That is just a fundamental limitation of that kind of study. So, but even so, the 7-country study became sort of the gospel. And then what ensued was, what you would imagine should ensue, which is that governments around the world, knowing that Ancel Keys' study was limited and that it couldn't prove causation, they funded trials on tens of thousands of people to kind of study randomized controlled clinical trial that actually can show cause and effect. And they did these studies all over the world. What did they show? They followed these people in these subjects until they died or had heart attacks. So it's called hard endpoints because they're trustworthy versus saying just measuring whether somebody's cholesterol goes up and down, which is called a soft endpoint. Altogether, more than 75,000 men and women were studied in these experiments, most in inpatient settings, like in hospitals, a kind of experiment that you can't do anymore because it's considered unethical but it means you could control all their food, so they're highly controlled experiments. What was the result of all that? No effect of saturated fats on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. This is not just me saying this. This is the result of more than 14 review papers that have now looked at all this data. They could not prove Ancel Keys right. And even worse, in many of these studies, what they found is that the group that ate more polyunsaturated vegetable oils, soy-filled cheese, soy-filled burgers, they died at higher rates of cancer in quite a few of these trials. However, why do we not know that this was the outcome of those fundamentally important clinical trials on the diet-heart hypothesis? Well, this is my slide to kind of try to explain how this could happen. And it really amounts to politics more than science. In the center of this picture is, on the left is Ancel Keys, and seated next to him is Jeremiah Stamler, his buddy from the University of Chicago. And this was this very small group of men who I call the nutrition aristocrats because they really controlled the agenda in science for a very long time. They held all the top positions at the American Heart Association. The NIH has always been very closely allied with the American Heart Association. They did all the major studies. They were the project leaders. They were on the editorial boards of all the major journals and would review each other's papers and publish them. So, and this largely remains true. I mean, the question I always get asked is, okay, I can understand this going on for 10 or 20 years, but how's this gone on for 50 years? I mean, there's still a small group of people who have continued to control the agenda in science. Now, this group includes some women. It's not all men, but this is basically the continuing story in nutrition. And why, when people say to me, oh, you have no background in science, and I like to say, yes, well, I don't have a formal I don't have a PhD, but, my experience in studying politics, American studies, is really, I've drawn upon that education heavily to try to understand the the politics of science. So one of the things that went on in order to preserve the diet-hard hypothesis is that when each of these large clinical trials came out and didn't have the desired results, they would be ignored. That's called selection bias. And I want to just explain to you the most extraordinary example of selection bias that I ever came across, which was this study, the Minnesota Coronary Survey. It was the biggest ever test of Ancel Keys' hypothesis. So on some 9,000 men and women in 5 Minnesota mental hospitals, so inpatient settings. Again, you're controlling all their food. Half the people are getting normal meat, cheese, full fat, milk, dairy. The other half are getting margarine, soy-filled cheese and meat. And this experiment went on for 4.5 years. And at the end of that, this was the result. They could not find any difference. They could not find that the people who had steadfastly avoided saturated fats did not see any cardiovascular benefit. And they didn't publish these results. They didn't publish them for 16 years, even though it was an NIH-funded study, which is sort of, it's a little bit like lying in science. I mean, when they did publish them, they put them in this out-of-the-way journal that they knew that nutrition scientists would rarely read. And much later, when a journalist asked Ivan France, pictured here, who was one of the project investigators, another one was Ancel Keys, Ivan France was asked, why did you not publish your results? And he said, well, there was nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. And then just a couple of years ago, a group of scientists at NIH went back to look at this study. They actually found data in Dr. France's basement that had never been examined or published, and they published their findings in the British Medical Journal, and that was a finding that was even more extraordinary. The more the men lowered their cholesterol, the more likely they were to die from cardiovascular death. So that was another inconvenient finding that was not published. And it's important to understand that if findings are not published, if they don't end up in journals, even if they do end up in journals, many of these publications came out, but they were like sort of what's called silent studies. They're just, nobody talks about them. They're never quoted. They're not included in review papers. They just sort of disappear from the general conversation amongst nutrition scientists. And this has been going on for decades. I mean, one of the things that I'll talk about later is what I found when I examined the scientific underpinning of our dietary guidelines. And one of the things I found was that no dietary guideline committee had ever reviewed any of these clinical trials. Never been used, funded by the NIH at taxpayer expense, and never been used to inform any of our nutrition policy. So what happened after that? In the late 1970s, Senator George McGovern gets interested in nutrition questions. He holds a series of committee hearings, and his committee comes out with this Dietary Goals for all Americans, that in order to prevent killer diseases, heart disease, but now cancer is on the rise, another killer disease. This report featured here was written by one of the staffers on that committee, who turned out was himself a vegetarian and was very put off by the meat industry, whom he viewed like people, sort of like big tobacco, people who were trying to cover up the ill effects of their product. So this vegetarian wrote this report, the Dietary Goals. He was largely influenced and led in this report by the American Heart Association. So this report really just was a download of the American Heart Association advice, and that's what became our dietary guidelines. A few years later, our dietary guidelines are launched in 1980. So that is what happened in 1980. That's quite extraordinary. This is, of course, a correlation, not causation. But I will make the case later that I think there's quite a lot of evidence to show now that to support the idea that there's a degree of causation here. So, but this is what we're told, right? We're told it's all our fault, that we are fat and diabetic because we are gluttonous and lazy. So is that true? So here we'll go to a poll. Do you believe people get fat by eating too much and exercising too little?
Wow, this is pretty neat. They got 5 choices here. Be ready to vote. Yes, I think it's all about calories. 2, I think it's more complicated. 3, for me, this method has led to substantial weight loss. 4, for me, the method was not led to sustainable weight loss. And number 5, I hope there's another way. Got to get some pills here. Counting calories is no fun. So, Corey, I vote for number 3, actually, to be honest with you. Do you want to get into this vote here since you've had some experience as well?
Well, the calories in and calorie out is part of it, but when we look at some of the things we put in our bodies, if you put sugar in a cow or in a person, it's going to go straight and processed immediately by the liver. So I think it's just a little more complicated than that. So
okay.
I'm going to go with number 2.
Okay. Well, I tell you, Nina, we have a lot of voters. They're really voting here today. Let's, Jim, let's close it off. We got 75% of the vote in, over 120 people. And what do you think of the votes here, Nina?
Oh, sorry. I just clicked the wrong button. I'm not getting it on my screen. Yeah, it is more complicated. Good for you. Nearly 60%, it is more complicated. 28%, it is all about calories in, calories out. That is what we've been told. And then some folks think that there's, it's worked for some, hasn't worked for some, about the same. So, well, this is a really just incredibly important subject for everybody, for you for people who are producers, but also for people trying to be healthy. So let's look into this. One of the things that is really one of the things we're told is that we haven't followed the guidelines, and that's our problem. And this is just a chart to show. This is a chart. I dug up this data. Nobody really shows you this data, and you can get this data in terms of calorie consumption or also in terms of food availability. It really shows that in every category, Americans really have followed the guidelines. It's surprising, right? I mean, who would have thought? We have increased our grains like we were told. We've increased fruits and vegetables, and those numbers are bigger if you look at them in terms of consumption rather than calories. And we've increased nuts, not pictured here, but we increased fish. Well, added sugars is one, but actually for a long time there was no recommendation about added sugars until recently. So for decades we've been following the guidelines, I would say. We've also followed it in terms of our macronutrients. So we have reduced fat, as we were told, and we've increased carbohydrates. That's that big bottom slab of the food pyramid, right? Grains, pasta, cereals, those are all carbohydrates. And we have, as we were told, increased those by quite a bit. And yes, it's true, we do eat more calories now, but all those calories come from carbohydrates. So it's interesting. Do we know if it's more calories or more carbohydrates? At this point, I would say from this graph, we really don't know. So what I want to, and we've been told that, exercise, we don't exercise enough. And what the data really shows on that is quite different from what we've been told. This is the report that was used to support the dietary guidelines. They tell us to exercise, do aerobic exercise 45 to 60 minutes a day. That's a lot of exercise. I personally do not have time for exercise of that. But here is something that makes me feel better, because it turns out that physical activity, and by here they mean aerobic exercise, is really not enough to bring about clinically significant weight loss. I'll just tell you, there's some amazing studies in this category, including a year-long study where they got a group of people and trained half of them to run marathons, and the other half didn't do anything. And at the end of a year, there was no difference in weight loss in the two groups. That's a rather depressing outcome. But here's another report from the Dietary Guidelines. Said they looked at sedentary behavior. They said that it cannot be shown to lead to obesity. This doesn't mean that it doesn't. It just means that there's not enough evidence now to support that contention, which for the time being is good news for you couch potatoes out there. And so in all, there's a growing consensus that you really can't exercise your way out of a bad diet, that really it's nutrition far more than exercise that drives weight. So we have to consider that maybe it's not our fault. I mean, we've been following the guidelines, maybe we haven't been exercising enough, but maybe that's not really the main driver of obesity. So maybe there's something about the dietary guidelines themselves that is flawed. So what does the science now say? And what I'm now going to take you on is a kind of whistle-stop tour of the last 15 years of science, the real science that's been done out there. And the reason you may not know this is, again, goes back to that notion of those silent studies that are not talked about, not in the media, not in the press, but they are out there. If you do a rigorous, fair-minded review of the literature, this is what you'll find. And the first one we've already discussed: saturated fats do not cause cardiovascular mortality. So that refers to the clinical trial evidence, which is more rigorous, but they've also looked at the weaker epidemiological evidence and found that saturated fats have no association with heart disease. All right. Such that the Canada's Heart and Stroke Foundation recently dropped their percentile limit on saturated fats. This was in 2015. And there was quite an extraordinary study that came out last fall called the PURE study. This is Salim Youssef is the immediate past president of the World Heart Federation. This is the biggest ever epidemiological study ever done. It's with people around the world. And the conclusion of that study was that the more saturated fat you ate, the healthier you were. And that the people who ate the lowest amount of saturated fat, in other words, if you followed official recommendations and had 6 to 8% of your calories of saturated fat, you had much higher risk of stroke. So I know this is a weaker form of evidence, but when it contradicts official advice, it has to be taken seriously. So, and this is just showing you a little bit of the paradigm shift on saturated fats. Credit Suisse did a report in 2015 saying that the markets were going to shift on fat. You just wait. And the Lancet, I put this out there because it's a review of my book that came out several years after it was published, but saying, look, we have to reckon with this. This book will make you angry, but on saturated fats, we've checked the references and this is correct. So it shows you that there is paradigm shift starting to take place. So number 2, does eating cholesterol worsen blood cholesterol? That's something else we've been told. And that turns out not to be true. Your body wants to maintain a steady level of cholesterol in the blood. So if you eat a lot, then your own endogenous production will go down. If you eat a little, you'll start producing more of it because your body can create it. And so so really, it doesn't matter how much cholesterol you eat. And it's turned out this has been known since the 70s. It just took a very long time for this science to percolate up to expert bodies. But the American Heart Association and the USDA Dietary Guidelines, which are most important official nutrition recommendations, they have actually both dropped their caps on cholesterol. So you may have seen this in the news. It's okay to eat egg yolks again. Your days of egg white omelets are over. And you should eat the egg yolks because that's where all the nutrients are in the egg. Also okay to eat shellfish, and if you like it, liver. So this is Ansel-Keys' hypothesis, saturated fat dietary cholesterol. Neither of those have been found to be true by the science. Myth number 3, the low-fat diet does not work. Again, been tested on tens of thousands of men and women, NIH-funded clinical trials, the gold standard, and they have not been shown that they can be effective for fighting any kind of disease. The last expert committee for the dietary guidelines actually noted that the low-fat diet increases heart disease risk, which it does. The low-fat diet inevitably causes your HDL, that's your good cholesterol, to go down, and your triglycerides, another marker for heart disease, to go up. Also, not a good direction for that marker. So those are two signs that your heart disease risk seems to be getting worse on the low-fat diet. And that's especially true for women, it turns out. They have particularly bad response to low-fat diet. And that is why there is actually no more low-fat diet recommendation, which is something that nobody really knows, because there's been no official announcement about it. But if you go on the American Heart Association website or the Dietary Guideline website, there is no more official recommendation to avoid. There's no more low fat. Search the words for low fat and you cannot find them. But they haven't yet announced that to the public. So myth number 4, fat does not make you fat. Eating fat, the fat in bacon does not become the fat on your hips. The fat in creamy cheese does not become the fat on your belly. There's no connection between eating fat and getting fat. It's what I call the tragic homonym. That's just the same word. This Swedish government report came out, reviewed all the evidence, and said actually a higher fat diet was better for weight loss. And this is a Harvard study that came to the same conclusion. Fat does not make you fat. Myth number 5, fat does not cause cancer. Many of us remember avoiding fat to avoid multiple kinds of cancer, especially breast cancer. But when they reviewed all the evidence, this is the most comprehensive report to date, they could find no association between fat and any kind of cancer. This is backed up also by those clinical trials I showed you, which showed that restricting fat did not benefit any kind of cancer. So fat does not cause cancer. So what does cause disease? Well, there's now an alternative hypothesis out there called the Carbohydrate-Insulin Hypothesis. And the idea here is that carbohydrates, you see on the left, it can be anything from sugar to bread, pasta. Your body really understands all of that as glucose. And that glucose triggers the release of insulin from your pancreas. And insulin is like the king of all hormones for making you fat. Insulin takes glucose plus insulin and socks your fat into your fat cells. And that is what causes obesity, according to this theory. And if you are exposed to glucose over time, high blood sugar, low blood sugar, high blood sugar, low blood sugar, this is like if you have cereal for breakfast, then you have crackers as a snack, then you have a sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, that's your blood sugar going up, down, up, down, up, down all day long. And your insulin, your pancreas secreting insulin, eventually your pancreas gets exhausted and can't secrete the amount of insulin that you need. And your muscle cells, your body cells can no longer process the degree of glucose that you're trying to put in them. And this is what leads to diabetes. What is different about this hypothesis than what we've known in the past? Well, one thing is it means that not all calories are the same. A carbohydrate calorie is different in your body, has a different metabolic effect than a protein or a fat calorie. And that the difference of carbohydrate calories is mainly due to their insulin effect. So gaining and losing weight is not as simple as calories in, calories out. There's this hormone insulin that is regulating your fat storage, and that is much more powerful. What is the evidence supporting this theory? Well, there's now more than 70 controlled clinical trials, again, the gold standard of evidence, on nearly 7,000 people on all kinds of populations, men, women, sick, well, obese, postmenopausal, premenopausal, and even a study on children, and including studies that have lasted 2 years long. That's considered long enough to show if there are any bad side effects, which there have not been. And that study, so restricting carbohydrates consistently leads to greater fat loss than restricting calories or restricting fat. And also improves most cardiovascular risk factors. This is an amazing study that just came out last week, the largest ever study on type 2 diabetics. on a ketogenic diet that's very low carb. They also had continual support. They were supported via a phone app where they were continually monitoring their blood glucose all the time. 60% at the end of 1 year no longer had diabetes, which is an absolutely extraordinary result. I mean, here's the percentage of people that reverse their diabetes by following the official advice of the American Diabetic Association, and that is 0.1%. So these results are really revolutionary. And there's also the population on the diet saw their blood pressure go down. 93% of them either reduced or eliminated all dependence on their insulin, and they lost on average 12% of their body weight. So these are pictures. Nobody ever believes you about weight loss if you don't show some pictures. Here are people on the low carb, high fat diet. This guy up here, he actually has a website called I Ate Better and My Pants Fell Off. So these are real people. And this is to show that this low carb diet is hitting the mainstream. Various books about if you eat more fat, fewer carbs, you will lose weight and get healthy. And what about dairy in this whole picture now, with the science changing? What does this mean for the dairy industry? So I want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, there's increasingly studies showing that full-fat dairy is good for health. I would say that there was probably such an anti-fat climate not so many years ago that these studies would have been hard getting published. Hard to get this kind of unpopular data published, but they're now coming out. So, whole milk consistently showing higher full-fat regular dairy is better for health. Here's one on heart disease. So increasing your LDL, your HDL is good. HDL is your good cholesterol. And then otherwise, it doesn't have any ill effect on anything else that they measure. Here's a study on showing that if your kid is having full-fat regular milk, that it turns out those children, well, you see the headline always puts it as conservatively as possible, does not adversely affect excess adiposity, but actually the results in the paper show that the children having whole milk had the lowest body fat. That means they were the thinnest. So there are a number of studies like this coming out now. And there's some good signs for nutrition. I mean, for dairy, the issues are two. It's saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, right? So the fact that there are no more dietary cholesterol caps officially means that should no longer be a concern for dairy products. However, although it is not supported by any science, the caps on saturated fat remain. And that is why there is demand for low-fat dairy. And that is also why there's the demand for milk has gone down, because consumption of whole milk has dropped by 79% since 1970. And that has really caused the whole milk market to go down, because replacing whole milk with non-fat or low-fat milk, it seems people just don't like the non-fat version very much. I so little liked non-fat milk when I was a child that I just preferred to put water in my shredded wheats when we had to give up whole milk. So I think that it's the saturated fat caps have really had an effect on the milk market. And there's increasing competition, I guess it should read here, not just from soy, but from almond milk, coconut milk, soy products, but soy products is probably the most important one. There's a campaign out there by the soy competition to try to show dairy as being somehow bad. And so this is the 2015 dietary guidelines shows that campaign working. So now soy milk is considered one of the possible beverages to fulfill the dairy, the dairy allocation. So that is probably one of the largest I mean, it's really a shame here, not only because obviously soy milk, in quotation marks, is not real, but soy has all kinds of damaging effects on the body that inhibits estrogen. It's an estrogen inhibitor, so it's really not healthy to eat. So, the question that I always get asked is, when will we see change? And I'll just explain a little bit what's happened to me since I wrote my book, which is that I looked at the dietary guidelines and I thought, first of all, I realized how powerful the dietary guidelines are. They really control a huge amount of what Americans think about healthy foods, right? They're downloaded by every medical association, the Diabetes Association, the American Medical Association, American Pediatric Association, and then they go out to every healthcare professional, every doctor, nutritionist, dietitian, nurse on the front lines, so that every office that you go in to get advice on nutrition comes from the dietary guidelines. It's all just downloaded from the dietary guidelines. Dietary guidelines control school lunches, feeding programs for the elderly, military rations, women and infant children programs, the food in your hospitals, the food. I mean, it has a huge impact on the American food consumption. And so I looked in 2015 at the U.S. Dietary Guideline Expert Report, this report by experts, and I couldn't find any of the science that I knew had been published in the last 15 years. All that science I just told you about, none of it was in this report. And so then I wrote an article about this for the BMJ. It was this cover story, and that was so adored by the nutrition establishment that 180 people, and including all members of the Dietary Guideline Committee, wrote a letter to the BMJ asking them to retract this paper. And there was a year-long outside review, which was what the BMJ typically does when they get a retraction request. And after that year, the outside reviewer said there's no grounds for retraction, and there was, some minor corrections that had no bearing at all on any of the assertions in that article. So that is how I made myself even more popular with nutrition experts. But, and then I founded this group called this Nutrition Coalition, which is pictured here. And I really think that what it's doing is working towards trying to get this scientific evidence into the guidelines so that they are evidence-based. That's really the goal of our work. I don't think that we will see real change until that happens. So here we go. Knowing what you know now, the next time I eat dairy, I will
1, enjoy it more. 2, feel better knowing that I'm not shortening my life. 3, feel inclined to inform my MD or others. This should be interesting. I'm going to go with number 3, but that's okay. Corey, where are you?
I am definitely with you on this one, Mike, and I've enjoyed having conversations with medical professionals and handing out a couple of Nina's books, because I think, as she pointed out, their number one source for food and information is from the dietary guidelines, and we're learning more.
Well, we got almost 75% of the vote in, so let's post it up, Jim and Nina. What do you think of the response?
Well, I'm very happy to see all of this. I guess it was a win-win kind of poll. I'm glad to see people will enjoy their food more. I mean, this is really one of the benefits of this knowledge, is not having fear about enjoying the foods that you love and that are so completely delicious, right? I mean, fried cheese, how great is that? The fact that I lived for decades without fried cheese is a source of sadness to me. So I hope that this is also something that you all in the audience can now feel happier about. And I think there is also this desire to then to try to inform the people that you know about this knowledge, because it is we have been taught the wrong nutrition for 50 years, and it's time to change. All right, let me see if I can There we go. So this is what I'm doing now. I have this not-for-profit group, and I continue to speak, and I continue to write. And my goal is to try to speak up for the science. I really think that if we had good guidelines, it is completely possible that we could do what was done in that experiment with 60% reversal of diabetes, reverse diabetes in America, reverse obesity in America. I think it's possible. So I've made it my goal to speak up for the science. So I appreciate you're all listening today. Thank you very much.
We really appreciate this, Nina. You can check out, and all our web viewers can check out our archives at hoards.com/webinars and view any of the past 87 webinars that have already aired. This webinar, Animal Fats, Separating Fact from Fiction, will be archived later this week. To date, we've had over 126,000 views on our archive webinars. And you'll see on the screen next month here, we're going to have Jack Britt be our presenter on dairying in 50 years from now. And I think Jack has done a great job really looking at where our industry on the cow side and the science side will be in 2068. So with that, Mike?
We're ready to go to our questions as far as that goes. Nina, are you going to put your video up? And we had a couple questions that came in. First one from the Netherlands. How do we use science to work for agriculture? Or maybe you want to narrow that down just a little bit on the question, Nina.
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad question, but I'll tell you that, one thing that's really clear from my work is that the science has been done, but it hasn't been included in the guidelines that so affect the product. Really so many sectors of agriculture. So, it's. I mean, people say, "Oh, we need more clinical studies and we need more trials to better understand how to do our job or how to produce our products," and that's true. But it's really. It's so very important that the science that has been done, the taxpayer-funded science, NIH-funded science that's been done, is actually is used. So that, I mean, I think there's probably no greater impact than for the dairy industry than reversing those non-science-based caps on saturated fat. That would go a very long ways. So it's actually getting the science implemented, I think, is the problem here.
Okay, we have another question that came in before the webinar today from Canada. I'm halfway in reading of your book. My question is, how long will it take for the medical profession to accept the fact that you raised and to change their attitude towards meat and milk fat?
Yeah, it's interesting that doctors really are not the problem, in the sense that they are just given, first of all, they're given about 1 day of education in medical school on nutrition, and all of that entire day is based on the dietary guidelines. So, what they're taught is unfortunately not evidence-based. And then they are, almost all of them are required to then pass that on to their patients. I mean, I've heard from doctors who tell me, actually, I don't follow the guidelines because they don't work for me, but I cannot tell my patients because I work in a large medical practice, and they fear medical malpractice suits if I do not deliver the quote unquote gold standard dietary guidelines advice. So actually, this other doctor I know, she says she takes a picture of my plate, which is the current graphic for the dietary guidelines, and she just crosses out half the plate. She's like, forget the grains. But I don't think medical advice will change until the dietary guidelines change.
Very good. Here's some more that have come in. Seeing dietary guidelines provided by marketers with new labels to entice consumers to buy their product. Do you think this is true with the new labeling guidelines we're seeing coming on the scene right now?
Sorry, what is true of those labeling guidelines?
Yeah, the new labeling guidelines, are they enticing consumers to buy more of their products here on the marketplace? Do you think that's true?
The new labeling guidelines are mainly, I think, about added sugars, and so I'm not quite sure what they mean, which new labeling guidelines that question refers to. There are new label. You're supposed to. What's going on the label now is the warnings about added sugars.
Okay. Okay. Here's kind of a very meat-directed one, and that is there a difference between fat on the outside of the beef steak, because many people will cut that off, versus the marbling you find in the muscle of the beef steak? And there's some argument that one is healthier or less detrimental than others. Any thoughts on that one?
No, there's no difference between those fats. And I want to say something else, which is that the fat in any food is a combination of fat. So different kinds of fatty acids. So that's the fat in a typical porterhouse steak, for example, only 30% of that fat is saturated. Another third of that fat is something called oleic acid, exactly the same kind of fat you get in olive oil. So, and the other third is a mixture of unsaturated fats. So all foods are a mixture of fats, but whether it's, really it just comes down to a matter of taste. Most people like their fat marbled in with their meat because it just tastes better, and they don't want, but there's no reason to cut off the exterior fat.
Okay, here's one that kind of ties two questions together. Has anyone looked at fetal programming and how it affects our diets and health results? And what about the genetic aspects tied to that as well?
So that's a very interesting question. It's very hard to do that research, as you might imagine. One of the things that they do know is that what goes on in the fetal environment is extremely important for setting up the metabolic health of that child. And I think there is quite a bit of evidence to show now that if a child is exposed to continual insulin in their fetal environment, that they start out at a disadvantage, being already somewhat what's called insulin resistant, which is the condition that leads to diabetes, making them more likely to gain weight and become diabetic. how do you explain obese babies, right? They're not overeating. They didn't overeat in the womb. So it has to do with their exposure to insulin. And there are other factors that I won't go into them all. I think that in terms of genetics, we really don't have data except for in very crude ways on people's sensitivity to different kinds of diets. We know some people are lactose intolerant. We know that, on kind of some broad brushstroke things, but in terms of like sensitivity to saturated fat or sensitivity to coconut oil or this or that, there's just not very much data out there. Even despite what 23andMe, that genetic testing company, tells you, I know what the clinical trial research is, so I know that they don't have data really to support that kind of level of granularity.
Okay. Another question, what about refined sugars? And you may want to define refined sugars to our audience.
Well, sugar is just sugar, whether it comes in agave syrup or honey or in a soda. Sugar. If you're having straight sugar that is quickly processed in your body, leads to an insulin spike, and it doesn't matter if it comes from something that has a name like agave on it; it's still sugar. There's some evidence to show that non-refined carbohydrates like whole grain bread might be absorbed less quickly by your body, but it's not clear that ultimately has any benefit in terms of your weight gain or loss. Your body understands all carbohydrates as glucose, and the fructose portion of it. Sugar, table sugar, is a combination of glucose and fructose. So the glucose is what triggers the insulin response. The fructose goes directly to your liver, is processed by your liver, and it's excess fructose that is really now thought to lead to fatty liver disease, also becoming an epidemic in America. And just as a final thing, high fructose corn syrup, despite the name, is really pretty much identical chemically to table sugar. They're both about 50% glucose, 50% fructose.
Very good. Well, let's follow up on that glucose. Another question relates to, you watch TV now, there's ways to get rid of glucose out of the bloodstream now. Metformin, I think, is one of the common products. Is that another solution to try to excrete glucose rather than store it in the human body, or do you want to get into that discussion?
No, metformin is what diabetics take because they no longer have the ability to process sugars as effectively. I think it's people's personal choice. Would they like to eat sugar and have a dependence upon medication? And by the way, that path will not deter you from eventually getting diabetes, full-blown diabetes? Or would you like to restrict your sugar intake? I think that's a personal choice.
Very good. Another question here. They're coming in faster. We can answer them. Any comments on CLAs, conjugated linic acid from dairy products? What's your thoughts on CLAs?
Yeah, so CLAs are a kind of a variant of trans fats. This is such an interesting story. So when trans fats are made when you take polyunsaturated vegetable oils like sunflower, safflower, soybean oil, and you hydrogenate it. That means you harden it to make it into a product like Crisco. Well, that's what was going on since 1911 when Crisco was introduced. And then they discovered that that produced trans fats, right? Trans fats are one of the fatty acids that's produced by the hydrogenation process. And it was discovered that fatty acids have an ill effect on health. And so they banned them from the food supply. Unfortunately, caught up in that whole mess was conjugated CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, which has the same chemical formula as trans fats. But it is a different molecular formation. It's not quite the same. CLA is a naturally occurring fatty acid that occurs in ruminant animals, and their dairy and the products they create, which is dairy products. So CLA got caught up in this whole trans fat demonization because the FDA only recognizes the chemical formula. They don't take into consideration the molecular, the way the molecules laid out. So there's never been any ill effect demonstrated for CLAs, the naturally occurring fatty acid. Actually, I don't know where that stands right now. I think they tried to carve out an exception for CLA, but I don't know if they were successful in doing that.
Another question from one of our foreign attendees, and how many calories or what % of the calories should come from fat based on your book? So is there a guideline you have on fat either as a % of calories or % of diet or that you would recommend?
Yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint. My book is not a diet book. And I really only present the information, the science and the low-carb diet. The reality is that for people who are obese, diabetic, have heart disease, those people are carbohydrate intolerant. That is sort of the definition of what their condition is. And so they need to reduce carbohydrates, and it's different strokes for different folks. Like there are the irritating people who say like, oh, all I did was cut out dessert after dinner and that's all I needed to do to lose 50 pounds. And then there are people who really need to restrict carbohydrates, usually maybe if you have full-blown diabetes, down to really quite low levels, like maybe 20 grams a day. And those people are eating 60-70% of their diet is fat. And I will tell you that even though that sounds horrifying to many people, that has been shown to be completely safe and effective diet so it really depends on your state of metabolic health, and that is a continuum.
Okay, a couple of kudos for you. First of all, a couple to say thanks very much for a great presentation. We really enjoyed the webinar. Another question for our listeners is how quick will this webinar be available in the archives? Jim indicates by the end of the week is very common as far as that goes, so be watching for that on the Hoards website. And next question, do dietary guidelines, i.e. the food pyramid or the plate, influence how marketers advertise their products? In other words, low fat has been used on numerous products for years. Comments?
Yes. So yes. Is it yes? Yes. Because what happens is who regulates the comments that can be put on food packages? That's the FDA. And the FDA just takes their guidance from the dietary guidelines. So if the dietary guidelines say low-fat diet is good, then you're allowed to put on your food package, this low-fat product may reduce heart disease or whatever it is, or this product low in cholesterol, it used to be low in cholesterol Cheerios may reduce heart disease. When they got rid of the cholesterol caps, they had to withdraw those claims. But yes, it completely affects what you can say about your product. In fact, products that are now higher in saturated fat for this group of this huge growing population of people that believe that saturated fats aren't bad for health. And there's now a growing number of products for that population, people like me who eat more fat. But those products cannot put anything about it being healthy on their whatever they're producing.
Okay, here's your final question that we have, and that is, you use the word ketogenic diet. Now, for us dairy guys, we think that means our cow has ketosis, and they're mobilizing nephas. Is there any connection between a ketogenic diet and what we think about ketosis?
I don't know what cows do, but I can tell you that ketosis is what humans try to get into in order to mobilize their fat stores. So basically what happens on a ketogenic diet, which is very low carb, say 20 grams of carb a day and high in fat, is that because you're not giving your body any glucose, you stop using glucose as a fuel source and you start using something called ketone bodies as your fuel source. And so once that happens, you can start mobilizing all the fat on your body because your body is using fat as a fuel source. So, that's why you have fat, so that you can use it as energy, right? Fat is just your body's miracle way of like strapping granola bars all over your body. It's like, oh, I need that when I'm hungry. Now, if I'm in ketosis, I can use my fat cells to to give me energy. If I depend on glucose, sorry, just to finish this, but if I depend on glucose as my fuel source, I have to eat more glucose. So I don't know how it works with cows, but it works for humans.
I think it works for cows the same way. Very good. Well, Corey, we'll turn the program back to you to wind up. Great job, Nina. Just a great job, and we'll turn it back.
Well, I think this was very interesting at the end, all the way through. But Mike's a well-regarded cow nutritionist, and Nina, you talked a little bit about the doctor side of it, and a lot of our human doctors and our veterinarians certainly learn the body science for the people or the animals that they're working with, but if they don't take additional nutritional courses, that's kind of a thing they pick up on in addition. So the body and nutrition are very important and interlocked, so it's an area that we need to continue to improve on. Nina, I really thank you for joining us. This has been exceptional, and we appreciate it, and I hope our listeners have too. Thank you, Mike and Jim, as well.
Thank you very much for having me. It's just been a pleasure, and I really appreciate being here.